Most contractors spend years building a reputation, years building relationship, years earning trust from customers, suppliers, and regulators. And then one subcontractor makes a bad decision. Maybe workers show up without the proper credentials. Maybe payroll practices raise questions. Maybe safety certifications aren't what they appear to be. Maybe an investigator discovers that the people performing the work weren't the people everyone thought were performing the work. Suddenly, regulators start asking questions. And many contractors are shocked to learn that hiring a subcontractor doesn't necessarily eliminate responsibility. In some situations, it creates new responsibilities. Today, I want to talk about a growing regulatory risk that many contractors overlook until it's too late. And that risk is relying on trust when regulators expect oversight. My name is Nick Dogle. I am a North Carolina attorney and the owner and founder of North State Law here in Raleigh, North Carolina. My practice focuses exclusively on professional licensing. I represent licensed professionals throughout North Carolina when they face investigations, complaints, disciplinary proceedings, and licensing board actions. If you're a general contractor, electrical contractor, HVAC contractor, plumber, or other licensed construction professional, understanding the risk associated with subcontractor oversight is becoming increasingly important. Today we're going to discuss recent reports involving allegations of labor violation within portions of the construction industry and, more importantly, why regulators often look beyond the subcontractor who committed the violation and begin asking questions about the licensed contractor who hired them in the first place. Because in many cases, what begins as someone else's problem, like most things, can quickly become your problem. Most contractors view subcontractors as independent businesses. And legally, that's often true. Subcontractors frequently operate their own companies, manage their own employees, and perform specialized work under separate agreements. But regulators often view the situation differently than that. Regulators are focused on accountability. They're focused on consumer protection. They're focused on workplace safety. And they're focused on ensuring licensed contractors maintain appropriate oversight over projects performed under their authority. That's why investigations involve subcontractors often expand beyond the subcontractor itself. Investigators may begin asking questions such as, who hired the subcontractor? What due diligence was performed? Who verified qualifications? Who monitored their work? Who was responsible for ensuring compliance? The goal isn't necessarily to hold the licensed contractor responsible for every mistake made by another company. The goal is to determine whether reasonable oversight existed. And that's where many contractors find themselves in difficult situations, because trust and oversight are not the same thing. One of the biggest misconceptions I see is the belief that hiring a subcontractor somehow automatically transfers responsibility. In reality, things are rarely that simple. Let's consider a hypothetical here. Let's say John owns a successful contracting company. He's worked with the same subcontractors for years. The relationship is strong, projects have gone smoothly, customers have been very happy. Everything appears to be working exactly as intended. And because of that history, John becomes really comfortable. He stops verifying certain information. He just assumes licenses remain current. He assumes workers are properly trained. He assumes required credentials are in place. After all, there have never been any problems or issues before. Then a complaint's filed. An investigation begins. And investigators discover that some workers performing work on the project lacked qualifications that everyone assumed that they had. Suddenly, regulators aren't just looking at the subcontractor. They're asking questions about oversight. They want to know whether anyone verified the information, whether anyone checked their credentials, whether anyone exercised meaningful supervision over the project. And that's often where problems begin. Not because someone intended to violate the rules, but because assumptions replaced verification. Another area receiving increased attention involves documentation. And if you've seen any of my videos, documentation always comes up because it is super important. Now, recent reports in portions of the construction industry have included allegations involving fraudulent safety certifications, labor violations, and inaccurate records. Now, to be clear, most contractors are not engaging in intentional misconduct, but investigators frequently encounter situations where people accepted documentation at face value without asking questions. A subcontractor submits safety training records. Contractor assumes records are accurate. A project moves forward. Then months later, investigators begin reviewing the documentation and discover discrepancies. The licensed contractor may immediately respond, "I didn't know." And that may actually be true. But investigators often ask a different question. Should you have known? Was there a process for verification? Were there warning signs? Were there opportunities to identify the problem earlier? This distinction is important because regulatory investigations frequently focus on oversight failures rather than intentional misconduct. In other words, a contractor can find themselves answering difficult questions even when they had no intention of violating any rules whatsoever. This is where most contractors get into trouble. They confuse trust with compliance. And those are two very different things. Trust is valuable. Long-term relationships are valuable. Good subcontractors are essential to successful projects. But trust is not a compliance system. Trust doesn't verify licenses. Trust doesn't confirm training. Trust doesn't document oversight. Trust doesn't answer investigators' questions after a complaint's filed. When regulators become involved, they generally want to see evidence. They want to see records. They want to see procedures. They want to see that someone exercised reasonable oversight. Unfortunately, many contractors don't discover these expectations until they're already responding to an investigation. And by that point, it's often much harder to explain what should have happened than it is to prove what actually happened. One of the reasons these situations are so frustrating for general contractors is because the investigation often begins somewhere else entirely. Right? Now, years ago, I had a client who was a licensed electrical contractor who was subbing work to someone else via 1099. And the person who ended up doing the electrical work was not licensed. And that's a big no-no. Because the electrical failed multiple inspections, the inspector found out the person actually doing the electrical work was not licensed and filed complaints with the electrical board and the GC board. The reason the licensed general contractor had a complaint filed against his license is because the licensed GC just assumed that the licensed electrical contractor he had been working with for 5 or 6 years would not only pull the electrical permit, which he did, but actually do the work, not sub it out to a third party who is not licensed. Just because someone was doing something correctly last year doesn't mean they're still doing it correctly this year. Trade businesses are growing rapidly, and sometimes people change business practices to keep up with demand. There is a belief by some plumber contractors, electricians, and HVAC license holders that they can subcontract the work via 1099 to someone else who will do the actual work on your job. That is not correct. As an example, if you've been working with Acme Electrical LLC for 7 years and a work truck with ABC Electrical on the side of it shows up every day on the job site to do the electrical work and you didn't notice, then that's a potential problem. Because if ABC Electrical is not licensed and or they're not on the permit, that's where it becomes a major issue. One of the best ways to ensure that Acme Electrical is actually doing the work is to make sure you coordinate with the licensed qualified electrician for the company and have him go through with what day or days his company will be there and confirm with him that he will be there at least the first day to coordinate with his people as to what work will be done and when and what safety precautions are being taken. That's incredibly important for electricity. Generally speaking, the contractors who place themselves in the strongest position are the ones who understand that oversight and verification is an ongoing process. It's not a one-time event. And verification matters. Just like documentation matters, communication matters, and consistency matters. In many cases, what protects a contractor during an investigation isn't the absence of problems. It's the ability to demonstrate that reasonable steps were taken to identify and address problems before they escalated. That's a very different mindset than simply trusting that everything is being handled correctly. And it's often the difference between a contractor who can confidently respond to questions and one who is scrambling to reconstruct information after an investigation has already begun. Most contractors don't lose sleep worrying about subcontractors. They worry about deadlines. They worry about budgets, materials, employees, and they worry about their customers. Is the customer happy? But many regulatory investigations begin because someone, somewhere in the project chain, failed to follow the rule. And when investigators start asking questions, they rarely stop with the person who committed the violation. They often examine who hired them, who supervised them, and who is responsible for oversight. The lesson isn't that subcontractors are a problem. They're not. The lesson is that trust alone is not enough. Because when regulators begin reviewing a project, they usually expect to see more than trust. They expect to see oversight. If you'd like to learn more about contractor investigations, be sure to watch my video about how worker fatalities often lead to scrutiny of supervision, documentation, and management decisions long before regulators focus on intent. This video is general educational information about professional licensing in North Carolina. It is not legal advice. It does not create an attorney-client relationship, and every situation is different. Nothing here predicts the outcome of any particular case.